All right. Good evening, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we're here with another of our virtual events. And tonight we have our friend Dennis Palumbo joining us again to talk about his brand new book, Panic Attack. And as always, I'll be monitoring the comments or the chat fields on Facebook and YouTube. So if you have questions for Dennis, as they occur to you, just put them in and I'll be happy to ask anything. So Barbara, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. Dennis, it's so nice to see you. Dennis and I have a long relationship with Poison Pen Press, and it's really fun to talk to him about books that over the years we've developed. Daniel Rinaldi's character, and he's had lots of exciting things going on. So
yes, he has.
Let's talk a little bit about Daniel and how you conceived him. This is a really elementary question, but what's the difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist?
A psychiatrist is a medical doctor who can prescribe medications. A psychologist has similar psychological training, but they can do, for example, psychological testing for schools or mental status exams, but they cannot write you a prescription for Xanax. They can't operate as medical doctors. The psychiatrist is a medical doctor who does additional work in their residency on the psych ward to become a psychiatrist. It's the longest, next to being a surgeon, it's about the longest journey in the medical school world to become a psychiatrist.
Well, Daniel Rinaldi, the reason I brought it up, is a psychologist. It's important to understand the difference. And part of what he does is he consults to the Pittsburgh Police Department. So what does he do in that role?
Well, he is a consultant, as you say, to the Pittsburgh Police, and he is an expert on trauma. He's experienced trauma in his own life. For readers who don't know, before the series of books began, Daniel Rinaldi and his wife were mugged coming out of a restaurant. The mugging went sideways. His wife was killed. He was wounded, but he survived. And so he was left with this kind of survivor guilt, and as he said at one point in one of the books, I survived because I've had some unearned luck and I've been trying to earn it ever since. And so he consults with the Pittsburgh police, working with victims of violent crime, people who may have survived the carjacking or the home invasion, but they're traumatized by the experience. They have symptoms we tend to associate with post-traumatic stress disorder. I've worked with a number of victims of assaults, rapes, carjackings, and the after effects are quite powerful. I was also really fortunate. Before I wrote this series of books, I spent 5 years studying with Robert Stollerow, the nation's #1 trauma expert. He's one of those guys that if they blow up a temple in Israel, the government calls him to talk to the first responders. So I learned an enormous amount of how you treat trauma victims. And so I put that together with my own experience growing up as an Italian American in Pittsburgh, the son of a blue collar family, the first of 9 grandchildren to go to college, the first one to have a profession. So my character, Daniel Rinaldi, is a lot like me in that regard, except he is a former amateur boxer, which I am not, and he's much more brave and resourceful than I am. What I think also I enjoy about the books is writing about my hometown of Pittsburgh. Even though I live here in Los Angeles and have for many, many years, Pittsburgh's undergone this enormous renaissance. I mean, when I was a kid going to Pitt, I worked my way through Pitt in the J&L steel mills. Those steel mills are all gone. And so Pittsburgh has this kind of weird thing going on where there's this uneasy relationship between its past and its present. It used to be kind of an industrial, shot in a beer, blue collar town with cobblestone streets and streetcars rattling down the road. Now it's much more white collar. The hub of state-of-the-art technology. in robotics and one of the #1 medical cities in the world. And as a result, many of the old neighborhoods have been gentrified such that the people who've lived there for generations can no longer afford it.
Yeah.
There's lots of new construction in downtown Pittsburgh. It's become this new Renaissance jewel, with a lot of high rises and buildings of shining glass and silver. And yet, ironically, all the steel that's poured in the foundations is imported from Japan.
Yeah, I know. I mean, you could mistake it for Sydney if you weren't paying attention.
That's
And of course, because it's at the confluence of the major rivers that form the Ohio, those rivers were horribly polluted. So, for a long time, that was a real black mark, so to speak. But, that in any industrialized nation, there's always a huge amount of fallout, a lot of pollution. I mean, the British have paid the price. We paid the price in our so-called Rust Belt or manufacturing belt. And it's interesting that in the 21st century, how much of this is being repurposed and gentrified. I mean, it's true in New England where old factories, are becoming shared space for artists or, some kind of public housing or something. I remember in downtown Richmond, there was a restaurant, I think it was called the Tobacco Company, I'm not mistaken. And back in the 70s, because I'm so old, I remember all this. It was a tobacco warehouse that was one of the first things to be repurposed in industrial Richmond. And, kind of a foretaste of the kind of things that were going to happen. But Daniel, what else you've imbued him with is that he's really nosy. And he's, he is,
He is,
so
I know.
Even though he's only supposed to be treating trauma victims for the Pittsburgh police, somehow or other, he bulls his way into every investigation. So he has a very conflicted, combative often relationship with the police department, and occasionally comes very close to being booted away from his.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he's always having as a threat always that his contract is going to be canceled because he gets involved in cases. Now, because he's an amateur and he's not an actual police officer, one of the hard things for me, I mean, Panic Attack is the 6th book in the series. One of the hard things for me is to figure out a way he could legitimately be involved.
Yeah.
In the first novel, Mirror Image, a patient who's been trying to emulate Daniel and dress like him gets killed. And so it looks as though Daniel himself was the target. And so he becomes involved. In Fever Dreams, there's a armed bank robbery, and the only survivor is so traumatized she can't speak. So the police bring Daniel to talk to him. In Phantom Limb, we open the book with a therapy session with a patient. And at the end, as she's walking out, Daniel gets hit on the head and she gets kidnapped. So I always have to figure out a way that we can involve him in these cases when he has actually no business being there.
Well, you have to make it, unfortunately, it's the same problem that people who write amateur sleuth books run into, is that you almost have to make it personal in order for him to pursue it. I mean, why does the cat sitter solve a crime?
Well,
whatever.
what I try to do with my books is one's personal, and then the second one, like Mirror Image, the first one is personal because he feels guilty that he allowed his patient to emulate him. And colleagues thought at supervision sessions that what he was doing was horrible and unethical. So then when the patient gets killed, Daniel's so guilt-ridden, he has to become involved in trying to solve it. In the second book, Fever Dream, he's just working as a consultant. I try to vary it. Because
I know you do. I still think Fever Dream is your most interesting plot. I just so love that book. And in the book before Panic Attack, it is very personal to Daniel, ways we won't talk about, and works on resolving his past to some degree. But here we are in Panic Attack. And you know what, Dennis, before we talk about the story, why don't you tell us what a panic attack might be and why you called the book that?
Well, I called the book Panic Attack for a couple reasons. Primarily, it's because I wanted to tell the story of a sniper on a rooftop downtown, and that the city would kind of go into a kind of collective panic. And this was also driven by the pandemic we're under. There's been a tremendous rise in panic attacks since COVID-19. And the funny thing is, a panic attack is, we associate anxiety attacks with, oh, we're anxious, we're scared about something. A panic attack is very different. It has a deep physiological aspect to it. In fact, your breathing becomes shallow, your heart's pounding. Most people having a panic attack think they're having a heart attack.
Right.
They're sweating, they can't catch their breath. One of my patients years and years ago was driving the freeway, and he drove himself right to the ER figuring he was having a heart attack. The thinking now about panic attacks is some severe trigger. It's not like, oh, I'm anxious because I'm going to a job interview. It's a severe trigger. 9/11 was a trigger. A divorce, it can be a trigger. A huge financial loss, the death of a family member, where life suddenly seems unmanageable. And so your tendency as a result is to suppress as much as you can that anxiety so you can have your daily life and pay your bills and drive your car. And at some point, your psyche can't deal with it anymore.
So can it be
Literally fight you. Your body kind of rebels. And that's the panic attack.
So can people die from it?
No. No one has yet that I know of has ever died of a panic attack unless they have a pre-existing cardiac issue.
Oh, okay.
It's a little bit like COVID. If you are immunocompromised, you have a much greater risk of death from COVID. In panic attack, if you have heart issues or sometimes respiratory issues, you can go into a rest, you can go into a coma, but it's very, very rare. Most people, what you need to do is sit with them, hold their hand, have them deep breathe as much as they can, slowly in and out. Now, if you're having recurring panic attacks, antidepressants are usually prescribed.
Okay.
A course of talk therapy is recommended. Remember, if your body is reacting so strongly, it's because it's giving something that's happening around it a meaning. So, for example, let's say you were assaulted in a parking garage. Then you avoid parking garages as long as you can until you have to go to the doctor's, and the only place to park is a parking garage. You're going to have a flashback often walking through that parking garage. It'll remind you of what happened to you before, and that triggers panic attack.
Well, does it get more severe? If you have repeated attacks, do they tend to grow in severity?
They grow in severity unless you have some kind of intervention. Particularly, a lot of people are afraid to talk about panic attacks. They think they're a sign of weakness, or they think they just need to get over something.
Well, that's like PTSD too, right?
Yeah, very much like PTSD.
Right. I mean, that's been a problem.
Different is PTSD has very specific symptoms, like recurring images of the thing that traumatized you initially, real vigilance about potential danger, and the fantasy that if it happened to you once, it will happen to you again. So you're always on the lookout for it happening again.
Well, as I understood it, I'm sorry I talked over you there for a moment, that oftentimes military veterans or first responders and all regard PTSD as a sign of weakness too, and so they don't want to acknowledge it.
I've worked with 2 firefighters in my practice whose PTSD symptoms were so obvious, and both of them to a person kept saying, but these sessions are confidential, right? I mean, you don't have to tell anyone what we're working on. And I say no, because the only thing I might have to do, because all therapy sessions are confidential. However, if there were a lawsuit or some kind of civil action, a judge has the right or the power to revoke what's called privilege. in which case I do have to talk about the symptomatology and what I've observed. Normally, what you have to do, certainly police psychologists know this, whenever a police officer is involved in a traumatic event, they're usually assigned to a police psychologist. And the only thing the police psychologist has to do is either register that police officer as fit for duty or not fit for duty. They don't have to disclose anything that the police officer says or reveals about himself or his family or his prejudices. The only thing the psychologist has to do is say fit for duty or not fit for duty. Otherwise, you can't have treatment with people who are afraid to tell you anything.
Yeah, no, I can see that. I think, don't I remember that Bosch has a session where Bosch is, forced to go to a police psychologist, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Of course, being Bosch, he hates the whole thing, so.
Of course, yeah, it's the last coyote. Liking the psychiatrist a lot, but quite resistant.
Right. So this book starts, the instigating incident. Daniel is out of town, or not in downtown Pittsburgh anyway. He's at a sporting event. And what happens? I really like the Teasdale Tiger. I thought that was very well named. I like the alliteration.
Yeah, this is based on something that's real. My daughter, the University of Pittsburgh, has a mascot called the Pitt Panther. So when the Pitt Panther football team is out on the field, we've all seen these mascots on TV. Well, at Pitt, the identity of mascot is a secret. And people who have played the mascot take to the grave the fact that they were the mascot. They have to swear never to reveal they were the Pitt Panther.
Oh, I love it. It's like the Official Secrets Act, isn't it?
Yeah, isn't it amazing?
Yeah.
It's like a do not disclose thing. So in my story, Daniel Rinaldi has been asked to speak at a commencement, and then the next day there's a football game. This is at a small college called Teasdale College in a small, formerly thriving farming community, but like so many small towns in Western Pennsylvania, it's fallen on really hard times. And the crowd were watching the Teasdale Tiger, who is the mascot of the Teasdale Tigers. And he's coming out and he's doing his cartwheels and he leads the crowd in the tiger roar and everything, just like mascots do. And the dean of the school, who's sitting next to Daniel, says, "You know who that is?" And Daniel says, "No." He said, "Well, we borrowed this from Pitt. Nobody knows who the kid is in the tiger suit except me. And it's a kid named Jason Garland." And he said, "But you won't tell anyone, will you?" And Daniel says, "No, I keep secrets for a living. Don't worry about it." Anyway, they're watching the tiger do his thing before the game. And suddenly a shot rings out. A sniper has shot the tiger.
Oh, it was like a big game hunt. I know, it was awful.
I know. So Daniel and everybody runs down. And when they take the tiger mask off the kid, the dean goes, "Oh my God, that's not Jason Gorman." The book begins. And this ends up being the first of what is a seemingly random series of sniper attacks throughout the city, and how the city itself begins to panic. People calling their congress people and city government, asking for more police on the street, and people who have al fresco cafes pulling those chairs and tables in because no one wants to eat outside. And so I took the panic a lot of people had about the COVID, and I put it in the context symbolically of a sniper out there. And the thing that I like about the book, and that has been the response I've mostly gotten, is that about 2/3 of the way through the book, the actual sniper is captured. And then we learn that everything we thought prior to this has been wrong, and that the real mystery begins after he's captured. I know, and I can't.
You don't want to go any farther. So do you remember the Washington sniper, the tandem, the pair that in
the pair, yeah.
It happened during one of the national book festivals, or around one of the national book festivals. And it was my job at that festival to go with Tony Hillerman and interview him. And it was I can well understand the atmosphere that you depict in Pittsburgh, because Washington, everybody was really terrified. Nobody knew who these guys were. It appeared to be, and apparently it was, as it all turned out, totally random. But anyway, there we are out in the mall, with thousands of people in tents and whatever. And I still remember, Tony, you had a great sense of humor. He looked at me just as we're going to step out in public, and he said, remind me, he said, why are we here? Which is sort of his way of saying. And I said, well, fortunately, the security here is probably greater than anywhere else in Washington. And so we are almost surely, nothing's for certain, safer here than we might be. But it is truly terrifying when you think that somebody is picking people off at random because there's no defense, which is part of the problem with serial killers, at least the disorganized, maybe both, maybe the organized and disorganized ones, but they can instill so much panic because you can't predict who the next victim might be. You can't make yourself safe, when there's no logic behind it.
It's interesting you mentioned the DC sniper, because the FBI profilers at Behavioral Science at Quantico profiled him as a disaffected mid-30s white man with no college education. And it turned out to be an older Black man and a younger Black man working together. And so it just shows, in Panic Attack, the police and the FBI form a task force. So I get to demonstrate a lot of how profilers think and act and the assumptions under which they go, such that when we find out what's really going on in the book, all of those assumptions get blown up. And I think that that's one of the things that I enjoy about the book. I also like Daniel Rinaldi's relationship with the FBI agent Gloria Reese. I kind of enjoy that. I have a number of readers who are unhappy that Eleanor Lowry's out of the picture, but life changes. She's spending every week hanging out with the love of her life, who's in prison. Speaking of fever dreams. So I like the fact that in my series, characters grow and change. We move in and out of relationships. People get married, people get divorced. In Head Wounds, a recurring character who people love doesn't make it. So I like that. And Daniel's also getting older. Like Harry Bosch, Daniel's getting older. And I also hint a little, I did it in Head Wounds, but I really do it in Panic Attack. He may be an alcoholic. And so I may play with that a little. The problem is in Pittsburgh, everyone drinks like a fish. So
how can you distinguish? We used to.
It's pretty much hard, even for a clinician. I'm there. Well, Daniel may be an alcoholic, or he just may be an Italian American. So it's real hard to tell the difference, particularly after work.
My late father, who was a very large man, he was an All-American and, just a wonderful guy. And towards the end of his life, he died very suddenly of septic shock, which was a result of reflux. But in any case, I remember talking to his doctor one day and saying, I'm a little worried that Daddy's becoming an alcoholic and all. And the doctor looked at me and he said, most of these old guys drink a lot to sort of quell all the aches and pains of age. He said, but I know your dad. And he said, he just likes to drink. It's not, it's a totally different thing. And it is hard to distinguish that when somebody can really pour it down. It's difficult to know whether they are in fact hooked on it, alcoholics, or whether they just really enjoy drinking, but can put it aside. I mean, over the years, I have certainly known a lot of people where that question has arisen. I'm astonished at how much the British can drink, for example.
Oh God, yeah.
Or the
how
Irish.
early they start doing it.
Well, yeah, but I mean, and it's part of it. There's a whole pub culture involved, where men go down the pub, so to speak, and that's how they spend their time. Some of them nurse along a pint of beer forever. but a lot of the women and the young people go to raves and parties and all, and it seems to be a goal to get
Yeah.
really, really drunk, which is
Yeah.
never interested in me. But
I know.
but
It's
then
very big.
are these in fact people on the road to alcoholism, or are these people?
It's interesting because
drinking?
there's so many conflicting theories. There's a genetic component, perhaps, your father or mother was an alcoholic. Also, the definition of alcoholism is a little blurry in the sense that there are people I know who drink quite heavily, but it doesn't affect their social or occupational function. They're just functioning drinkers.
Yeah.
There are other people for whom drinking that much, they can't get out of bed, they can't hold a job, their marriages end, So a lot of it, I think, has to do with the idiosyncratic nature of each person.
Well, I think you're right. And, if you think back to House, for example, he was a functioning dope addict, and I mean, nobody could say that he wasn't able to perform,
That's right.
his miraculous diagnoses and all the rest of it, even though, I was never entirely clear about the wisdom of trying to break him of it. I mean, obviously, because alcoholism isn't illegal and, opioids are. So we're crossing a new threshold, I think, with the legalization of marijuana. If
I
it's not a
think we are
criminal
too.
offense anymore, then, what happens with people who either can consume a lot of it and remain functional versus people who are
That's right.
young people who aren't.
Yeah. And also, I mean, I'm old and weed is 10 times stronger now than it was when I was in college. And so it does have a powerful effect on people. On the other hand, I think trying to keep it illegal is foolish. I think the whole war on drugs has been a disaster.
It has been. I agree with you. They ought to tax the hell out of it like they do cigarettes.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I think it should be more taxed and more regulated. But, it's kind of hard to do with something that can grow in your yard. You can't grow whiskey in your yard, but you can grow weed. And so
well, you can. Yeah. And that one of the horrible dangers that we're seeing with people who get addicted to heroin and other stuff is the introduction of other substances, to cut it, or fentanyl to make it more powerful. And, I have never understood being willing to play Russian roulette with your life like that, but I am fortunate that I am not a person who suffers from depression or rage or any of the things that might drive a person to it. So, I give a lot of credit to my genes and maybe some life choices. So
I think that's true. I mean, like with gamblers, I've worked with some gamblers. I'm not an addictive person, so I can't imagine someone who's addicted to gambling or addicted to alcohol. I have a glass of wine and I'll nurse it like I'm such a lightweight. It's ridiculous. But I don't have any idea that that's morally superior. I just think it is the way I am.
Yeah.
I think everybody's life is pretty hard. And whatever gets you through the night, I'm pretty much in favor of, as long as it doesn't impact someone else. If you want to get drunk, fine. Don't get behind the wheel of a car. Don't be picking up your kid from school. Don't be that kind of stuff. As I get older, I feel so much compassion for humans that life, I think, is just harder than it needs to be. And to just bring me back to Daniel Rinaldi, one of the things that I really wanted to emphasize in his character was his compassion for foibles. Yeah. He has many himself, and he has a lot of compassion for how people struggle to get through their day. I think that that's really illuminated in his friendship with Noah Fry, paranoid schizophrenic who runs a bar called Noah's Ark down on the river. And Noah and Daniel, I think, represent a nice little dialogue throughout all the books about the struggle to be human, the struggle to be good. Noah is sort of like the crazy wisdom figure in indigenous cultures. He's no doubt crazy, even though he's kept pretty in check with meds. but he also has a real clear vision of how everyone struggles and doesn't judge. And so I think that's one of the reasons that the readers I hear from love when Daniel goes to that bar and talks to Noah. Because here you have a highly educated PhD and a paranoid schizophrenic who lived on the streets before friends bought him this bar. And they have a meeting of the minds. And I like that.
I do too. I also think that Daniel's never going to be a good candidate for a romantic relationship.
He's not good at it. He's not good at it.
But he was clearly very much in love with his wife and happily married, and the trauma of her being killed right in front of him might very well.
And he also, because he thought he should have been able to do something about it.
Well, the survivor guilt. Yeah, all of that.
Survivor guilt was so huge. And I think, it's funny, a friend of mine fell in love with a young girl when he was a young man, and they were both mountain climbers. And they had this idyllic relationship climbing up a mountain called Nanda Devi in India. She died in his arms of hypothermia on that mountain. He's never been able to have a long-term relationship since, because they were together before the big struggles that happen in a relationship. If you're going to be together 30 years, you're going to have to work some stuff out. She had this idyllic situation, and then she died in his arms. He's not been able to sustain a relationship since, because he carries that image in his head. This was the perfect one for me. And so I think for Daniel, his guilt and love for his late wife, he has relationships in the books, but he's always there's a moment in Panic Attack where Gloria Reese has spent the night. Daniel comes out of the shower and she's in the kitchen cooking some steaks. And Daniel thinks to himself, boy, she looks so comfortable in my kitchen. And that makes me uncomfortable.
Very good point.
You have a kind of friends with benefits relationship, because he doesn't want to get any closer than that, and she doesn't want to scare him away.
Well, at some point, if you write him long enough and he ages enough, you're going to have to. It's very hard to age well all by yourself. So,
I know. I speak from experience. Yeah.
Well, that could really be, I think. But we'll see. So before we move to questions, let me ask you: are you working on another book for Daniel?
Well, it's funny. He's a hard man to reach. I've called him a couple times and left some messages to see what's been going on in his life recently. He hasn't called me back. In all seriousness, what I was thinking I might do is one of the fun things about being a therapist. You go to a bunch of therapist conferences, and you've never seen as much backbiting and politics and small-mindedness that you see in a psychology convention. A guy will stand up and deliver a paper, and then the next guy will stand up and deliver a paper about why the paper before was full of crap. I mean, it's hilarious. And so I thought, what if a big hotel in Pittsburgh is hosting a therapist conference, and then there's a lockdown for some reason? There's either crime going on outside, or maybe like Die Hard, someone takes over the hotel and it's knocking off therapists one by one. I'm not really sure, but I like the idea of Daniel being an attendee at this conference. And this becomes the closed door room. You can't get out of this place. My books, they tend to go all over Western Pennsylvania. I thought it might be fun where the whole book takes place in this hotel.
It would be. Die Hard is an excellent sort of.
It's a model that I have in the back of my.
Yeah, now I can see that. I think that would be interesting. And, one of the reasons your books are, I think, Dennis, so intriguing is that you change them up every time.
Yeah,
they're not just.
I try to make them different. I try to make them different.
Yeah, no, you've done a wonderful job with it. And I certainly enjoyed reading them over the years. So I'm looking forward to whatever comes next. Let's call Patrick up and see if he has questions or comments from the audience that he'd like to treat us to.
Sure. Actually, our friend Joe Perry has a question for you, Dennis, which is, can a physical trauma trigger panic attacks?
Oh, absolutely. If somebody, let's say, is hit by a car and their arm is injured and damaged, they could easily succumb to a panic attack because they don't know the severity of the injuries. Again, I had a couple first responder firemen whose panic attacks came as a result of racing into like a burning building or trying to get someone out of a smashed car and getting injured themselves. And so they don't know the extent of the injury and they might have a panic attack. The thing that separates panic attack from regular garden variety anxiety attack is the physical symptoms, the physiology, the palpitating heart, the shallowness of breath, sweating. You really do feel like something's wrong.
A lot of people think they're having a heart attack, right?
Yeah, they think they're having a heart attack.
Chest
Let's say a dog bites you.
Yeah.
You've been afraid of dogs your whole life and you get a dog bite. It's going to set off panic in you because you don't understand the severity of the wound.
Do you think in some ways it's your body telling your mind, we've had enough, you know?
Well, actually, that's interesting because the body usually dissociates when it's had enough. A panic attack, you're really aware of your physiological symptoms.
Right.
If you have let's say a robber comes up to you with a gun, and then when you're talking to the police 10 minutes later, you don't actually know how to describe the robber or what happened because you dissociated for about 10 minutes. That's the psyche protecting you from such overwhelming feelings of fear that it kind of goes, we're out of here. We'll come back into consciousness once this guy leaves.
Right.
And so often people don't believe that victims of assaults can't remember stuff, but it's because they, for that moment, dissociate.
So it's a protective kind of response.
It's a protective mechanism.
Interesting. Let's see here. Nellie asks, she says, given your background as a psychotherapist, when you start writing a new book, do you first flesh out the characters and then devise a plot around it? Or does plot come first or does character come first? Is what she's trying to ask.
For me, not only does characters come first, I'm a total pantser. I never outline anything. So I'll have a character in mind, like with Panic Attack. The only thing I knew is I want to shoot a mascot at a football game. I don't know who he was. When the guy gets shot and everyone runs down and takes off his mask, it wasn't until that moment that it occurred to me, oh, that's not the guy that the dean thinks it is. So I'm a total pantser. Now, I don't recommend that to people because there's a lot of false starts. It's maybe the least efficient way to write a thriller, particularly one that has so many twists and turns. And the big reveal in Panic Attack was a surprise to me too. So if you're a pantser and you're like me and you start with character, I'm 100, 200 pages into most of my Daniel Rinaldi novels before I know who the killer is. And then I have to go back and lay in all the clues and the red herrings. But I'd rather write than think. So in my old career as a screenwriter, I had to outline so completely and then get so many notes on the outline before I could even start writing. And I like the organic quality of making it up as they go along. I figure if I'm surprised, the reader will be surprised.
You know, that's an interesting thought because one of my final comments about Panic Attack was going to be that Daniel is constantly being wrong-footed as this investigation goes along. And it really frays his relationship with the police department. And then there's the sheriff's department in this smaller farming community. So is his wrong-footedness because you sort of stumbled into one corner after another?
Absolutely. I follow my nose writing these things, and that's why Daniel gets so many things wrong, because I'm getting them wrong as I write it. And plus, in a case like this, where there's a big case, snipers and FBI and the sheriff, it gives him so many authority figures to rub the wrong way.
Right. I think that conflict is in all police procedurals, which in a way this kind of is, even though he's the psychologist, that there always has to be, it seems to me, conflict in the department. Police departments are run along military lines to a great degree, with chains of command and so forth. If you're really interested in this, you ought to watch Line of Duty on on Netflix, which is really, there's some serious plot holes in my opinion, but aside from that, you really see this, military structure and how it can work both for and against the work that the police are supposed to be doing. And I think that makes it more interesting in police procedurals if there is department tension along with the investigation.
Well, yeah, because in my Rinaldi books,
character too.
Yeah, in my Rinaldi books, most of the people he works with think the idea of having him on the payroll is a mistake.
Yeah.
And that gives us a nice piece of tension that goes from book to book, that at any moment now he could be dropped.
Right. And he won't be destitute because he can always, have a private.
Oh, he's still in private practice.
Yeah, exactly.
Patients. Yeah.
But on the other hand, his nosiness will take a hit. So,
yes.
Anything else?
One reader liked the book but complained because a couple times during panic attack, he cancels his patients for the day because he's involved in the case. And one reader wrote to me and said, I wouldn't keep working with a therapist who kept canceling me because he's doing something else.
That's also been true in a couple of series that I can remember, cozies mostly, where, they involve a bookstore and the bookseller's forever closing the store, putting a sign on the door to go off and investigate. And
that's exactly
there's not enough margin of profit in a bookstore for anybody to have that kind of attitude.
No, I must admit though, I get a lot of mail and response to my books. I'm very pleased about it. But the emails and phone calls I get from Pittsburgh residents are the funniest because I've been in LA for 40 years. I, depend on my friends, Google Maps, all that stuff. And boy, if somebody from Pittsburgh, when I hear from them, they're never talking about the plot or the characters. They're telling me I got something wrong. They'll say, oh, you have Daniel make a left on South Street at 5 o'clock. You can't make a left there, and people get crazy about that. And I did have one wonderful thing happen. I got an email from one of the city planners of Pittsburgh who said she liked the books, but that the way I have Daniel going home from Oakland to Mount Washington is the least efficient way. And she showed me a map of what Daniel should do, what roads he should take, and what bridge he should go over. I use that from now on. I gave her acknowledgement in the book.
You adjusted his route?
I did adjust the route.
That's the problem with writing about a real place,
I know.
as opposed to making it up. But
I know.
Also, I think that mystery readers, are delighted in solving crimes and clues, and also they're much more likely to pick up on something like that.
Well, they feel like this is our book too,
right?
You're writing about their community. Yeah.
Is there a last question there, Patrick, before we wind this up?
Boy, I'm tempted to ask you a question.
Okay.
Do you think, by and large, that with the what do they call it, the DSM, the manual, it's all these new, additions to it. Do you think that, this is a huge generalization, that kids are being taught resilience the way they might have before? Are you noticing, or is there more of an identification with, my ailment or my diagnosis?
I think the latter. In fact, I think one of the real problems nowadays is the overdiagnosis of children. Yeah. And then there's trendy diagnosis. It used to be ADHD was the big diagnosis. Now it's bipolar in 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds. That's crazy.
Yeah.
I remember when I would watch at my son's preschool, and I'd see a bunch of boys running around like lunatics. That wasn't ADHD. That was being an 8-year-old boy. I mean, so I am very concerned with the overdiagnosis. And see, the thing that I think the average person needs to understand is diagnostic manuals and that whole vocabulary. exists for the convenience of the labelers, so that all of us clinical geniuses can talk to each other. But they don't mean anything. A bunch of guys with beards, now women, get together every 5 or 8 years to do a revision of the DSM, which is the diagnostic and manual that all therapists use and all insurance companies rely on. But we're making the stuff up. Homosexuality used to be a mental illness. Now it's not. If you have a psychotic episode where you hallucinate, but it's 3 weeks or 6 weeks or less, it's called brief reactive. If it's longer than 6 weeks, but shorter than 6 months, it's called schizophreniform. If it's longer than 6 months, it's schizophrenia. These numbers were arbitrarily chosen, like daylight savings time. There is no medical or organic reason why
they'll say
labels are chosen.
They'll say, on a scale of 1 to 10, would you say, you know, those kind of questions seem to be the norm?
They really are. Well, I think Dennis is right. There's a terrible tendency, certainly in the book selling world too, to assign labels to everything, which, you know, is, you know, I'm a librarian in one of my past careers, and the thing you learn about all cataloging systems like the Dewey Decimal System or the Library of Congress system is that all cataloging systems are exclusionary. You know, I mean, they allow you to find things, but they also are arbitrarily exclusionary.
Well, the way I look at it is there's no definition of normal. There's an old joke in the clinical work. If you're early for your therapy patient appointment, you're anxious. If you're late for your therapy patient appointment, you're resistant. If you're on time, you're compulsive. So you have a psychiatric diagnosis no matter whether you're early, late, or on time.
There's no sweet spot?
There's no sweet spot for normal. The DSM, the manual, acts as though there is an objective normal.
Well, you know what? That's the perfect way to end this.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's totally crazy. And one of the things
your takeaway for watching this program tonight is there is no definition of normal. But you know, that's Dennis's point, is each of us is an individual physically and mentally, and you know, to try to categorize us, label us, or define what's normal was really a waste of time. So let's hope that Daniel is able to continue his adventures. Panic Attack has been out for a month or so, and we certainly have copies here at the store. Dennis, thank you so much for your time tonight. It's been lovely to see you again.
Oh, it's so great to see you again, and also you, Patrick. I love talking to you, Barbara. You can ask me questions till the cows come home.
Well, I'll look forward to seeing your next manuscript, kiddo. It'll be great.
Maybe in person.
Right. Happy holidays.